What exactly does the Indo-Pacific mean? Okay, so now it's a new buzzword. Everyone's talking about it, and it's usually it's a transformation from the earlier Asia-Pacific to the Indo-Pacific.
You talked about that India can play the role of a bridge.
It's essentially changing from a continental mindset to a maritime one.
As we're progressing ahead in time, the bridges are getting fewer and fewer right there. Does the whale dance? The Indo-Pacific's global logic. Hello and welcome everyone, and welcome to the podcast at the NATO-India Youth Conference. Today we have with us Mr. Soham Agarwal, who's a lawyer who's now focusing on maritime security, and he's from the National Maritime Foundation. And we're going to be talking to him about Indo-Pacific and everything surrounding it. Mr. Soham, now, but before we come to Indo-Pacific, I would want to talk about European security. And NATO is having an Indo-Pacific pivot. It's coming to Indo-Pacific. And a lot of people have been asking these questions that when Europe is itself facing some security threats with a war going on, how much sense does it make for NATO to come to Indo-Pacific with its pivot? What do you have to say on that?
Thanks, Pratyaksh. So essentially, before I answer that question, I think it's important to delve into what exactly does the Indo-Pacific mean. Okay, so now it's a new buzzword. Everyone's talking about it, and it's usually it's a transformation from the earlier Asia-Pacific to the Indo-Pacific. So what has changed? One is essentially changing from a continental mindset to a maritime one, because Indo-Pacific is more a maritime construct focusing on the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, whereas Asia Pacific was more a land centric concept, extending from Europe all the way up to the Asian part of Russia. Now, in the West was included in the Pacific domain. So, one is the global change in geopolitics from a land centric idea to a maritime idea. So, why has that happened? That has happened because people have realized and the world has realized that a majority of global trade flows through the seas. More than 95% of global trade is through the seas. Because of global trade, you have products flowing from one place to the other. You have business, you have merchandise trade, you have services flowing as well. But what's also important, you have critical products like oil that flow through the seas, and you need oil for energy security, to ensure that your national economy can sustain itself, because if you don't have oil, you can't run your industries. If you can't run industries, you can't produce, and your national economy takes a major hit. So that's why you realize that because a majority of trade actually flows in this region, you have economies in the Indo-Pacific, such as Southeast Asia, Asian countries, you have South Asian countries, including India, which are booming markets. Because they're moving back markets, there's more investment that is going to happen in this region, and there is more money to be made. And all of this money can only transport and channelize to the rest of the world through the seas. So that's why there was a realization that you need to focus more on the maritime domain. So what Indo-Pacific represents is a strategic geography. It is a geographical landscape wherein your strategy will be devised and implemented. So you essentially said that this is the area in which I want to focus on, and because I identify that this region of the world is what is most important to me. So for India, Indo-Pacific is a strategic geography where we want to implement our strategies. Similarly, for the US, the change of Indo-Pacific has signaled within the actual Indo-Pacific strategy, they have signaled that they want to support India's rise as a regional power. Because India is another democratic nation, there is a shared values, and there also realizes that India's rise will be a peaceful one, because the culture of India does not ever indicate hegemony or dominance, as opposed to other players in the region who have Middle Kingdom attitudes, where they are the center of the world, and everything around them are vassal states. So because of that, because the US is also pivoting to the Indo-Pacific, we see that as a consequence, the NATO also wants relevance in this region. The European Union as well wants relevance in this region, and that's why you see in the past couple of years they have devised a strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So that's because they realize that business is here, the world's interest is here, and therefore money will also be put into and pulled out from this region. So that is what drives NATO's engagement in the Indo-Pacific, or at least that's the way they're marketing it now, because they've also established partner countries in this region. So Pakistan's a NATO partner, or Japan's a NATO partner, South Korea is a NATO partner. So that's why they've always tried building cooperations in this region. Marketing it in this way brings them into the picture uh, in the whole discussion involving the Indo-Pacific. With respect to does it make sense for NATO? Um, well, as the name itself suggests, it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, right? So that is their primary area of focus. And their focus has been predominantly a land centric European security model. While the maritime domain is inextricably linked to any security operation, to any security dynamic, it's been very land focused. And it still remains their primary focus because, as you see, there are internal challenges. European nations now have to spend much more of their GDP on defense, that and they have to make choices between the guns and roses debate we see in economics classes. So while it's they are marketing themselves, they are trying to pivot themselves as relevant in the Indo-Pacific. It is largely going to, in my opinion, remain a Europe, an Atlantic centric organization. But that doesn't exclude any conversations or dialogues with countries in this region, especially India.
All right. So I think before we further explore Indo-Pacific, I think Indo-Pacific needs to learn a lot from the episode of Europe, right? Or let's just say we could say the Indo-Pacific is the new transatlantic, given the pivot that's happening. Now we see a lot of world powers wanting to come to Indo-Pacific, mainly the Western powers. Back in the days, the same similar trends happened after World War II, and then the world pivoted to Europe. And now we've reached to a point where Europe itself is being asked to increase its defense spendings. So when the world powers is now coming to Indo-Pacific, as a India, as an Indo-Pacific state, or let's just say about all other states as well, do they take in some sort of security that the world's power bring in themselves because that's what they're doing, or do the Indo-Pacific states go like, wait a second, you're coming here, we might do collaboration with you, we might do dialogues with you, but we've got to be self dependent, because what if in the next 30 years then it's the same world powers who come to us again and then go like, we saved you or something, like
Absolutely.
a similar version
Yeah.
of that.
So, and you've hit the nail on the head that we shouldn't ask how India can collaborate with NATO, but the question should still be whether we should or not. Why NATO? Because we have to understand that NATO as a organization is an alliance. They say they're a political military alliance, but they're predominantly a military alliance. And we have to also distinguish NATO from the EU, and we have to distinguish NATO from their actual member states who act as independent sovereigns in their own capacity, right? So I personally, so while discussions have revolved around, India's changing its stance from non-alignment to multi-alignment, and therefore we can talk to NATO as well. Sure, we can talk to them, but I don't think we've necessarily answered the question about whether it is in India's interest that NATO establishes a further presence in the Indian Ocean. The counter to that is that NATO member states, especially the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, are already resident Indian Ocean partner or players, because the US, through the Diego Garcia, the UK, who actually owns the British Indian ocean territories, which now, even though the ICJ judgment handing over back to Mauritius, uh, they're still very much in the play here. France has its overseas territories in the Indian Ocean. So these are already resident major resident powers, and India has bilateral ties with each of these individual countries, which are already growing. So we're talking to individual NATO member states, individual member states. We're talking. We also have bilateral relationships with other EU member states. We're increasing our cooperation with EU. We've also recently signed up to the combined maritime forces in West Asia, and and there's specific task force which deal with non-traditional security threats. And India has now become more comfortable even in joining multilateral partnerships under the US control rather than the UN control. So we see that there has been an opening, but the question still answers why should it be NATO? Because we have other avenues, we have other alternatives that will not hit our sensitivities and our uh, principle in of non-alignment, and to make sure that we can be a partner to all rather than have a significant alliance. I think this was best demonstrated in the 2022 Raisina dialogue, when right after the invasion of or the movement of Russia into Ukraine, we had Anthony Blinken and Sergei Lavrov in Delhi and at the same conference. And it is only we also have delegates from Iran and delegates from Israel at the same conference. So India can play that role. India can be that bridge. And the moment we start aligning with certain alliances that can be perceived as contradictory to one power, we loosen or weaken our leverage and our bargaining powers in getting everyone together and being and that Vishwaguru that
Okay.
India aspires to be. So that's why NATO is an important question. So
You talked about that India can play the role of a bridge, right? And as we're progressing ahead in time, the bridges are getting fewer and fewer right there. Because back in the days, at least even US and Russia used to talk. But again, as you talked about that Blinken and Sergei Lavrov, it was not so much the case. Now, because India can play the role of a bridge, and that sort of brings me to my next question, which is that there's this perception in people that, oh, NATO is now coming to Indo-Pacific or it's arriving. But if you really look at it that way, NATO has always been part of the Indo-Pacific through its member, through its partners, like partners like
absolutely.
Japan and Australia and South Korea. So if NATO has already had these significant partners, and one of them they're now giving, or rather US is giving nuclear submarines to, then why are they also pivoting to India? Because they've always been part of here. Why India? Where does India, in your perception, do you think figure in the perceptions of NATO?
Well, why India, to be honest, is a question that NATO needs to answer. As in, why is India being engaged? But I think a lot of it also comes uh, from the fact that India is a growing power and it's growing really rapidly. And it's poised, it's already a middle power. And over time, as our economic heft grows, so will our military heft. Once our military heft grows, so will our diplomatic heft and leverage, right? All of this will play a role, and India is positioning itself to be a really strong regional leader. It is already a regional leader. It's competing with China for influence in the region, and partnership of NATO with against China is problematic, right? Because of tensions between China and the US and general mistrust in the American circles of the Chinese establishment. And you see that there's been, while the Europeans who were hitherto really comfortable with Chinese investments, have suddenly grown more suspicious of Chinese investments, and they see and this whole attempt of China to utilize debt trap diplomacy in order to get what they want from the region, right? So if China is not a good partner and not a trustworthy partner, who else is there in the region? India. India is the main other player in this region. And in order to extend their influence in this region, you need to have India on your side. Um, Once you have India on your side, that gives you more legitimacy and more room in the area to operate, right? So while the freedom of high seas mandates that warships and NATO warships can fly through the region. If you want to have legitimacy and not be viewed from through suspicion, having all players on board is extremely important. So that's where the role of India becomes more important to NATO.
All right. Now, this is going to be the last question for this conversation, and which is to say that even in the panel discussions, right, that we were a part of, we've been discussing throughout this conference NATO India and a lot of implications for that. But let us sort of zoom back and then talk about the strategic cultures that NATO and India represent. For example, NATO represents collective defense, and India represents its strategic autonomy or multi alignment, as we like to say it right now. Now, where do these strategic cultures meet, right? Because of course they're distinct, but of course they might have some common points. Where do you think they meet, and what do you think the confluence is going to look like? Not right now, not tomorrow, but let's say in times ahead, say 5 years from now. Where does this confluence go from here?
Right. So I think the answer to that is non-traditional security threats, right? So NATO as a military alliance was conceived to tackle the Russia challenge at that time, right after the Second World War. And we saw that now, while even though state and state conflicts still remain relevant in today's day and age, there is a different strategic culture between India, which has always been a proponent of non-alignment, with a military alliance, which is completely antithetical to that. Was actually NAM, the non-aligned movement was born out of this whole creation of NATO and Warsaw Pact in India, and newly decolonized states wanting to stay away from that entire mess happening in Europe, right? So I don't foresee that changing. Um, where alignment may happen is addressing non-traditional security threats. So your first threat, for example, especially if we contextualize it to the maritime domain, would be in IUU fishing, which is illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. So IUU fishing is a problem for all states. It has challenges not only on sustainability, challenges on sovereign rights, but there are also severe established linkages between IUU fishing and narcotics trafficking over the world seas, right, world oceans, because these vessels, which are usually engaged in IUU fishing, also transport narcotics. We see linkages between narcotics and funding of terrorist activities. So, all of these things are linked, and these are shared challenges. And because these are shared challenges, they naturally are ripe for collaboration. Because here you're not acting against one particular state or one particular enemy, but you're targeting a problem. And if we target this problem together, if we come together, it is more efficient to solve these problems. So how do you come together to solve these problems? One is knowing where the location of these IUU vessels. For that, you need marine spatial awareness, right? You need to know at all times in a particular place at a particular point of time where those ships are, who those ships are, track their movements, analyze trends. And because of the vast nature of the ocean, it's not possible for just one country to be able to uh, handle it by themselves, right? You need different assets in different parts of the world. And now that you have different assets, so for example, a French vessel has identified that a vessel is engaged in illegal fishing and also transporting drugs. But the closest vessel that can take action is Indian, some other country, right? It's Indian. So how can you share that information?
All right.
Like, hey, look, there's a vessel there. We've spotted it. We need someone to go and take action
And
on
it
it.
has to be you.
It has to be. It can be you. It doesn't have to be you,
Yes.
but it can be you.
Should be you.
Do you want to volunteer, or do you want to take up the responsibility? And the other country can say, no, I'm not in a position to, but I know that he or she can. So if she can do it, then they're in a better position to be able to do it. So they can come on board and address that problem. So if we can share information, we can identify vessels, we know that our problems are similar. So this way, addressing non-traditional security threats can be the convergence point of different strategic cultures.
You know, I really like that analogy because one of the things that you said was that, sharing of the information, because you don't always require institutions, right? Because institutions, well, they're great, they bring a lot of substance, but sometimes they can also sort of stop you back. For example, look at SARC, right? I mean, so much institutions, but then
Yeah,
nothing to be done. But then, if you can just share information, you can practically cooperate, and that's just as good as being in an
absolutely. Yeah,
institution in its own way.
you are cooperating. Yeah.
All right, so I think one of the takeaways that we should take from here is that if India and NATO has to go ahead, which they are very much going on to, they need to share a lot more information to, whatever capacity that they can. And it's been a wonderful conversation, Mr. Soham. Thank you so
Thanks
much.
for having me. It was a
Yeah,
pleasure.
it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.